Boone County Courthouse, October 14th, 8:58 a.m. A woman walks into a quiet room where her own family is waiting to destroy her life. My name is Elle Morgan, and in 2 minutes my parents will ask a judge to declare me incompetent so they can steal my inheritance. They sit across the aisle in tailored suits, smiling with the confidence of people who have always overlooked me. They think I am here to surrender. They don't know about the secret lying in my briefcase or the weapon I forged in the dark while they were sleeping. They think they are erasing me, but they have no idea they just walked into a trap. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. The heavy oak door of the county courthouse didn't creak when I pushed it open. It swung with a silent, well-oiled weight that felt like the lid closing on a coffin. I adjusted the strap of my bag, feeling the frayed edge of the leather dig into my shoulder. It was a thrift store find, just like the charcoal suit I was wearing. I had spent 20 minutes steaming the wrinkles out of the jacket that morning, trying to look like someone who deserved to be taken seriously. But as soon as I stepped into the courtroom and saw them, I felt the familiar shrink of my own confidence, that old conditioned reflex to make myself smaller, quieter, invisible. They were sitting on the right side of the aisle, a united front of polished wool and confident posture. My mother Carolyn was whispering something to the man beside her, a lawyer whose suit probably cost more than my car. He had the kind of haircut that required weekly maintenance and a briefcase that looked like it had never touched a dirty floor. My father Stephen sat with his arms crossed over his chest, his jaw set in a line of bored irritation. When our eyes met, he didn't wave, he didn't frown. He literally rolled his eyes, a gesture so dismissive it hit me harder than a slap. It was the look you give a waiter who messed up an order, not your daughter walking into a legal battle for her own autonomy. And then there was Ethan. My older brother leaned back in the bench, one arm draped over the wood, like he was holding court at a frat party. He gave me a smirk, a tight, knowing expression that felt like a threat carved into a smile. He looked at me, and I knew exactly what he was thinking. Here comes the mess. Here comes the mistake we have to clean up. To them, I wasn't a person with rights or a life. I was an inconvenience. I was a structural problem in the family architecture that needed to be renovated out of existence. I walked to the defendant's table, placed my scuffed briefcase on the polished wood, and sat down alone. The air conditioning was humming, but I felt a prickle of sweat on my back. It felt like an ambush, even though I had known this date was coming for weeks. The power dynamic in the room was suffocating. It was a physical manifestation of my entire childhood. Ethan was the golden boy, the one who got the fully funded private college tuition, the new cars, the networking dinners. He was the athlete, the charmer, the one whose achievements were shouted from the rooftops. I was the responsible one, the one who worked part-time jobs at the library and the diner to pay for community college textbooks, the one who transferred to state school to save money. At family barbecues, my parents would brag about Ethan's latest venture, and when asked about me, they'd offer a tight apologetic smile and say Elle is our quiet one. She's still figuring things out. I remembered a framed photo that used to hang in the hallway of my parents' house. It was from a vacation we took when I was 14. Ethan was center frame laughing, flanked by my parents. I was on the edge, and because of the way the frame was matted, my entire left side and half my face were cropped out. It was accidental, they said. But looking at them now, flanked by their high-priced legal mercenary, I realized it wasn't an accident. It was a rehearsal. They had been trying to erase me from the narrative for years. The only person who had ever truly seen me wasn't in this room. My grandfather, Henry Hank Morgan. He was a Vietnam vet with rough hands and a spine made of steel who had built a construction company from a single pickup truck. I closed my eyes for a second and pictured him. I remembered my community college graduation. My parents had forgotten the date because Ethan had a networking dinner for a startup that didn't even exist anymore. But Hank was there. He sat alone in the bleachers wearing his Sunday best. Afterward, he grabbed my shoulder, his grip firm and grounding. The world needs people who get back up, Elle, he had told me, his voice gravelly with age and smoke. Resilience beats charm every time. You keep your receipts, kid. Never let anyone rewrite your story. They can't erase you if you've got proof. Keep receipts. That was the only thing keeping me upright, as the bailiff's voice boomed through the room. All rise. The judge entered, a woman with a no-nonsense face and reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. The room shuffled to its feet. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. I looked over at my family one last time. They looked so assured. They thought this was a formality. They thought they were here to sign some papers and take control of the one thing Hank had left specifically to me. The judge opened the file and read the case name into the record. Her voice was dry, stripping the moment of its emotional violence and leaving only the cold legal reality. In the matter of the conservatorship of Elle Morgan. The words hung in the air. Financial incompetency. That's what they were claiming. My own parents were arguing to the state of Missouri that I was too unstable, too reckless, too confused to manage the multi-million-dollar education trust my grandfather had left me. They wanted to strip me of my agency, to declare me an adult child to manage my life as if I were a piece of property. They thought they had me cornered. They saw the cheap suit and the terrified look in my eyes and assumed the victory was already won. But as I gripped the handle of my briefcase, I took a slow, steady breath. They didn't know what I had in this bag. They didn't know what I had been doing with my nights for the past 4 years, while they were busy praising Ethan. They thought they were erasing me. They had no idea they were trying to bury a landmine. But the fear was still there, cold and sharp. Because if this went their way, if their expensive lawyer charmed the judge and their lies became legal fact, I wouldn't just lose the money. My own family would own me. The road to that courtroom didn't begin with a fight. It began with silence in a small law office 3 months earlier. The air in the room had been stale, smelling of old paper and the cheap cologne my brother Ethan always bathed in. My grandfather Hank had been gone for 10 days, and the grief was still a heavy, dull ache in my chest. But for my family, the grief seemed to have a stopwatch attached to it. They were solemn, yes, but underneath the black mourning clothes, there was a vibrating frequency of anticipation. They were waiting for their payout. In the hierarchy of the Morgan family, fairness had always been a code word for favoring Ethan. We all knew the script. Ethan would get the capital to fund his next big idea, my parents would get the liquidity to upgrade their lifestyle, and I would get a sentimental trinket and a pat on the head. When the executor, a weary man with thick spectacles, started reading, the script seemed to hold. Ethan received Hank's restored 1968 Chevy pickup and a collection of vintage watches. He nodded, satisfied, already calculating the resale value. My parents, Carolyn and Stephen, were left the modest savings account and the lake cabin, a property they had treated as their own for years anyway. They exchanged a look of comfortable ownership. Then came the rest, the bulk of the estate. To my granddaughter, Elle Morgan. The lawyer read, his voice steady. I leave the entirety of the Morgan Education and Development Trust. The silence that followed was absolute. The trust had been a background detail in our lives, something Hank had seeded decades ago. Nobody knew what it was worth, but as the lawyer listed the assets within it, stocks, bonds, accumulated compound interest over 40 years, the air left the room. It wasn't just money, it was freedom. It was a life-changing sum. My mother's face went pale, the skin pulling tight against her cheekbones. My father's pleasant funeral. Appropriate expression flickered and died, replaced by a look of cold, hard calculation. Ethan actually laughed, a sharp, barking sound. That can't be right, he muttered, leaning forward. Check the name again. But the lawyer didn't check. He picked up a handwritten letter attached to the will. Mr. Morgan included a personal note regarding this bequest. He cleared his throat. Ethan has charm and your parents have comfort, but Elle has grit. I've watched her work double shifts to pay for classes while the rest of you slept. She was willing to sacrifice comfort for a future. I know she won't waste this. For the first time in my life, I heard someone publicly choose me. I sat there, tears stinging my eyes, not because of the money, but because Hank had been paying attention. He had seen the late nights. He had seen the struggle. The fallout was immediate, though quiet. There were no screams in the lawyer's office, just a icy, radioactive tension. That tension festered for 2 weeks until I received the invitation. "Come for dinner," my mother had texted. "We need to talk as a family." I walked into my parents' dining room expecting guilt trips or passive-aggressive comments. Instead, I walked into an ambush. My parents were at the table, Ethan was there too, and sitting at the head of the table where Hank used to sit was a stranger. He was introduced as Martin Cole, a family attorney my father had retained. He was polished, smiling, and terrifying. "We're all so proud of you, Elle." My father started, his voice dripping with a warmth that didn't reach his eyes. "But this inheritance, it's a heavy burden. We want to make sure you're protected." Martin slid a thick document across the mahogany table. It was titled The Morgan Family Harmony Agreement. "This is a standard structure," Martin explained smoothly. "It moves the trust assets into a centralized family account. Your parents and Martin here will act as co-managers to maximize investment potential. You, of course, will receive a generous monthly stipend for your living expenses." A stipend, an allowance. They wanted to take the millions Hank had left me and give me pocket money. "Sweetheart," my mother said, leaning in her hand, reaching out to touch mine. I pulled back. "You've never been good with money. We can't just let you throw this away on impulsive decisions. We're trying to protect you from yourself." My heart began to hammer against my ribs. I felt cornered. "Hank left it to me," I said, my voice shaking. "Not to the family, to me." "Don't be selfish, Elle," Ethan snapped. "It's for the family legacy. Dad sacrificed everything for us. The least you can do is trust your own blood." I looked down at the document. The language shifted from Hank's wishes to our investments. I flipped to the back, scanning the dense legalese. Buried in paragraph 14 was a clause that effectively gave the managers total discretion to cut off funding if the beneficiary engaged in high-risk behavior. In their eyes, my entire life was high risk. "What happens if I don't sign?" I asked, looking at Martin. The lawyer's smile didn't waver, but his eyes went dead. "Well, Elle, if you refuse to cooperate, the family may have to involve the court to seek legal ways to protect your interests. It would be messy and public." It was a threat wrapped in silk. They were telling me to surrender or be destroyed. I stood up, my legs trembling. "I need time," I said. My mother's smile froze. My father's jaw clenched tight enough to snap a tooth. "Here we go again," Ethan muttered, pouring himself a drink. I grabbed the unsigned agreement and walked out. I didn't look back. I drove home with my hands shaking so hard I could barely grip the wheel. It wasn't love. It had never been love. It was about control. That night, I scanned every page of the agreement into my computer. "Keep receipts," Hank had said. 2 days later, I woke up to a heavy pounding on my apartment door. A process server stood there holding a thick yellow envelope. I tore it open in the hallway. The bold text at the top of the page nearly made my knees buckle. "Petition for appointment of conservator over the estate of Elle Morgan." They weren't waiting for me to sign. They were going to war. The petition wasn't just a legal document. It was a character assassination typed in 12-point Times New Roman. I sat on the floor of my living room, the papers fanned out around me like a debris field, reading the story of a stranger my parents claimed was me. To the court, they described a woman who was erratic, mentally fragile, and fiscally disastrous. To prove it, they had weaponized the most mundane details of my life. Exhibit A was a credit card statement from 3 years ago, showing a series of charges for takeout food during finals week. They framed this as compulsive spending, indicating an inability to budget for basic nutrition. Exhibit B was a record of me dropping a chemistry class in community college to pick up extra shifts at the diner. They called it a pattern of academic instability and lack of follow-through. They even included a parking ticket I had received 2 years ago as proof of reckless disregard for the law. It was a distortion field. They were taking the struggle of a young woman trying to survive without their help and painting it as the flailing of a child who needed a keeper. The humiliation didn't stay contained within the walls of my apartment. The next morning, I walked into the nonprofit legal clinic where I worked as a senior paralegal. I loved this job. I helped low-income clients navigate eviction notices and debt collection, ironic, considering my current reality. But when I arrived, the clinic director, a man I respected, called me into his office. He didn't ask me to sit. He turned his monitor around. On the screen was a public records aggregation site. My name was highlighted, linked to the conservatorship filing. Elle, he said, his voice gentle but firm. We deal with vulnerable clients here. Financial integrity is paramount. Until this situation regarding your competency is clarified by the court, I have to place you on administrative leave. It felt like the floor had opened up. David, this is a lie, I pleaded. My parents are doing this to get my trust fund. Then you'll prove that, he said. But right now the public record says you can't be trusted with your own affairs. I can't have you managing others. I walked out to my car carrying a box of my personal things, burning with shame. The system I believed in, the system I worked for, was siding with the narrative on the paper. If my own parents said I was broken, the world believed them. By noon, the digital court of public opinion had convened. Ethan had posted a status update on social media, vague enough to be deniable, specific enough to destroy me. Please keep our family in your prayers. Sometimes the hardest thing to do is protect a loved one from their own self-destruction. Money changes people, but family is forever. The comments section was a bloodbath of small-town piety. Church ladies I had known since Sunday school were posting praying hands emojis and comments like, "So brave of you to step in, Ethan," and "I always worried about her, she seems so lost." Cousins I hadn't spoken to in 5 years were chiming in about addiction and mental health, speculating on problems I didn't have. I scrolled through the feed feeling sick. They were dissecting me, my reputation, my privacy, my dignity. It was all being stripped away to justify my parents' greed. That evening, my best friend Renee came over. I expected outrage. I expected her to help me fight. Instead, she sat on my couch looking tired. Elle, she said softly, maybe you should just settle. I stared at her. What? Look at what they're doing, she said. They're going to drag this out. They're going to ruin you. Just give them half the money. You'll still have more than most of us will ever see. Is it worth wrecking your family over? It was the classic American compromise. Keep the peace, pay the toll, don't make a scene. For a terrifying moment, I considered it. I was exhausted. I was unemployed. I was a pariah in my own hometown. Surrender tasted like relief. I could just sign the papers, take the stipend, and let them win. I could stop the bleeding. But then I looked at the corner of my room where a beat-up cardboard box sat. It was the only thing I had taken from Hank's house the day he died. Inside was a heavy leather binder he had given me years ago, labeled simply, "For when I'm gone." I pulled it onto my lap. It smelled like his pipe tobacco. I had looked through it before, mostly for sentimental reasons. Old photos, letters, the deed to the trust. But tonight, I read it with desperate eyes. I flipped past the will, past the investment summaries, until I reached the trust bylaws. I ran my finger down the pages looking for anything that could save me. And there, buried on page 22, was a clause I had never truly clocked before. Article 9, Forfeiture. I leaned in, my breath catching in my throat. The legal text was dense, but the meaning was crystal clear. Any beneficiary who initiates or participates in legal action to deprive another beneficiary of their rightful share shall forfeit their own interest in the trust entirely. In the margin, in Hank's blocky, forceful handwriting, was a note in blue ink: "Trust but verify. If they ever try to erase you, let this speak." I started to cry. Not the hopeless tears of the morning, but tears of relief. Hank knew. He had sat in that house watching my parents and Ethan, and he had known exactly who they were. He knew they would come for me. He hadn't just left me money. He had left me a weapon. They weren't protecting me. They were walking into a trap Hank had set 10 years ago. I wiped my face. The sorrow was still there, but the fear was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. I closed the binder and opened my laptop. I didn't search for a lawyer. I didn't need to. I navigated to the State Bar Association website and clicked on the member login portal. My fingers flew across the keys, entering a username and password I had never shared with anyone. The screen refreshed and my profile loaded. Name: Elle Morgan. Status: active member. Date: admitted. October 14th, 2024. I stared at the screen. They thought I was the incompetent daughter who dropped out of chemistry. They didn't know I was the woman who had put herself through night law school while they were sleeping. They tried to use the law to erase me. Now I was going to use it to write them out of history. For years, my family had mistaken my silence for stagnation. They saw me working at the legal clinic, driving a 10-year-old sedan and wearing thrifted clothes, and they assumed I was just treading water stuck in the orbit of their success. They didn't know that while they were toasting Ethan's latest game-changing venture, that would inevitably quietly fold. 6 months later, I was sitting under the hum of fluorescent lights in a law library, outlining torts and contracts until my eyes blurred. I hadn't told them about law school. I hadn't told them because I knew the script. If I succeeded, it would be treated as a fluke or a threat. If I struggled, it would be proof of my incompetence. So I kept it yours. I ate vending machine dinners and skipped holidays to study. When I passed the bar exam on my first try, I didn't pop champagne. I sat alone in my car wearing Hank's old watch and whispered, "I did it." Now sitting on my living room floor with my laptop open, that secret was no longer just a personal victory. It was tactical advantage. I stopped reading the petition as a heartbroken daughter and started reading it as an attorney. I picked up the family harmony agreement again. Through the lens of my training, the manipulation was glaring. It wasn't just unfair, it was predatory. The document granted my parents absolute discretion over the principal, waived their fiduciary duty to report financials to me, and included a conduct clause that allowed them to sever my stipend if I failed to uphold family values. It was a legal straitjacket. They weren't trying to protect me from the world. They were trying to own me. Then I turned to the petition itself. It referenced a document I hadn't seen before, a second amendment to the Morgan Trust, allegedly signed by Hank 3 weeks before he died. This amendment supposedly appointed my father as the successor trustee immediately upon Hank's incapacity or death, bypassing me entirely. I pulled the original trust documents from Hank's leather binder. There was no second amendment. I placed the copy from the court filing next to the originals on my coffee table. I turned on my desk lamp and leaned in. The first thing I noticed was the notary stamp. The original documents were notarized by Mrs. Gable, a woman Hank had used for 30 years. The amendment was notarized by someone I didn't know in a neighboring county. The date on the amendment was a Tuesday. I checked my calendar from that year. On that Tuesday, Hank had been in the hospital for tests. I had been with him all day. He hadn't signed anything. I didn't stop there. I needed receipts. I called Mrs. Gable first. "I keep a log of every single signature, Elle," she told me, her voice sharp. "I never saw an amendment, and your grandfather wouldn't have signed one without telling you. He talked about you every time he came in." Next, I scanned the signature on the amendment and sent it to a forensic document examiner I had used on a clinic case the year before. I drained my savings account to pay for the rush fee. The report came back 4 hours later. High probability of digital manipulation. The signature appears to be a trace or a lift from a previous document. The pixelation on the curvature suggests it was not wet ink. They had forged it. My parents, the pillars of the community, had committed a felony to steal my inheritance. But why? Why take such a reckless risk? They were comfortable. They had the lake house. Why go nuclear on their own daughter? I logged into the county clerk's public records database, a tool I use daily for my clients. I started running searches on my parents and Ethan. The results that populated the screen made my stomach drop. Ethan's tech incubator wasn't just closed. It was buried under 3 different lawsuits for breach of contract and unpaid wages. He was hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt. Then I ran my parents. A notice of default had been filed against their primary residence 3 months ago. Their retirement accounts were likely drained to bail out Ethan's previous failures. The picture snapped into focus. They weren't attacking me because they thought I was crazy. They were attacking me because they were broke. They were drowning, and my trust fund was the only life raft big enough to save them. They had looked at their financial ruin, looked at me, and decided that sacrificing my freedom and reputation was an acceptable price to pay to maintain their facade of success. I felt a surge of pity for them, scared aging people, terrified of losing their status. But that pity was instantly incinerated by a white-hot rage. They could have asked. If they had come to me, told me the truth, and asked for help, I might have done it. But they chose to try to declare me incompetent. They chose to lie to a judge. They chose to erase me. I opened a blank document. It was time to write. Using Hank's forfeiture clause as the spine of my argument, I began drafting my counterpetition. I wasn't just defending myself. I was going on the offensive. Count 1, fraud on the court. Count 2, breach of fiduciary duty. Count 3. Motion to enforce forfeiture clause. I built my exhibits brick by brick. Exhibit A. The original trust. Exhibit B. The forensic report proving the forgery. Exhibit C. Mrs. Gable's affidavit. Exhibit D. The financial records showing their insolvency and motive. I was meticulous. I was ruthless. I was the lawyer Hank Morgan would have wanted me to be. The sun was coming up when I finished. The apartment was gray and quiet. My eyes burned, but my hands were steady. I navigated to the court's e-filing system. I uploaded the PDF, attached the exhibits, and filled out the metadata fields. When I reached the field for attorney information, I didn't type in a hired gun's name. I typed my own. I hit submit. A moment later, the confirmation email pinged on my phone. Filing accepted. Case number 24, PRO 00912. Attorney of record Elle Morgan. I stared at the glowing screen. They tried to erase me, Grandpa, I said to the empty room. Let's see how they like being written out. The bailiff's voice cut through the stagnant air of the courtroom, calling the case for the second time. In the matter of the conservatorship of Elle Morgan. I stood up. My legs felt heavy, but my hands resting on the cool leather of my briefcase were steady. Across the aisle, my parents straightened their spines, fixing their faces into masks of concerned benevolence. Ethan didn't even look at me. He was scrolling on his phone, already bored, assuming the outcome was a foregone conclusion. Their lawyer, Martin Cole, stood and buttoned his jacket, projecting an air of easy victory. Judge Marisol Green looked down from the bench, peering over her spectacles. She scanned the room, her eyes landing on the empty chair beside me. Ms. Morgan, she said, her voice brisk but not unkind. I see the petitioners are represented. You have filed a counterpetition, but I don't see counsel present for you. Are you waiting for your attorney? The room went quiet. My mother leaned forward slightly, a pitying look ready to deploy. This was the moment they expected me to stutter, to cry, to prove them right. I took a breath, feeling the air fill my lungs, expanding the space where my fear used to live. No, Your Honor, I said. My voice didn't shake. It carried to the back of the room. I am appearing as counsel on my own behalf. Martin Cole chuckled, a dry, condescending sound. Your Honor, with respect, the respondent's confusion regarding legal procedure is exactly why we are— I'm not confused, Mr. Cole, I interrupted, turning to face him. I looked back at the judge. My name is Elle Morgan. I am an attorney at law admitted to the bar of this state, active and in good standing. My bar number is 84902. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't the silence of anticipation. It was the silence of a vacuum sealing shut. I saw my mother's mouth open, then close. My father blinked rapidly, as if the image of me standing there didn't match the signal his brain was receiving. Ethan dropped his phone. It clattered loudly on the bench, but he didn't pick it up. "I see," Judge Green said. She typed something into her terminal, eyebrows raising as she verified my claim. She looked up, a new sharpness in her gaze. "Proceed, Ms. Morgan." I didn't waste a second. "Your Honor, the petitioners claim I am incompetent to manage the trust left to me by my grandfather Henry Morgan. To support this, they have submitted a document labeled Second Amendment to the Trust, which purports to transfer control to my parents. I am moving to dismiss their petition, and more importantly, to enforce the forfeiture clause of the original trust." "Forfeiture clause?" Martin stammered. He was rifling through his papers, looking lost. He hadn't read the whole binder. He had trusted my parents. "Exhibit C, Your Honor," I said, handing the bailiff the heavy binder. Article 9. My grandfather believed in loyalty and integrity. He included a specific provision: any beneficiary who initiates or participates in legal action to deprive another beneficiary of their rightful share based on fraudulent claims shall forfeit their own interest in the trust entirely. I heard a sharp intake of breath from the petitioner's table. "That clause is boilerplate," Martin argued weakly, "and our claims are not fraudulent. We are acting in the best interest of— This is Exhibit D." I cut in, sliding the forensic report and the notary affidavit across the table. "This is a sworn affidavit from the notary public listed on the so-called Second Amendment. She states she never notarized this document. The second document is a forensic analysis proving the signature of Henry Morgan was digitally lifted from a tax return filed 3 years ago." I turned to my parents. The pity was gone from my mother's face, replaced by a look of sheer unadulterated terror. My father was gripping the table so hard his knuckles were white. "You forged it," I said. "It wasn't a question." Ms. Morgan addressed the bench, the judge warned, but her eyes were fixed on my father. "Mr. Cole, were you aware of the provenance of this amendment?" I was provided the documents by my clients, Your Honor," Martin said, taking a visible step away from my family. I had no reason to doubt their authenticity. "Your Honor," I continued, keeping my voice low and controlled. "My parents didn't file this petition because they were worried about me. They filed it because they are insolvent. They are in foreclosure. They tried to use this court to steal my inheritance because they failed to manage their own." I looked at them one last time. I didn't see the giants of my childhood. I saw two desperate people who had decided I was expendable. "They claimed I was the one who needed to be erased," I told the judge. "They tried to take my name, my reputation, and my freedom. But the only incompetence in this room, Your Honor, is the belief that they could do this to me and I wouldn't fight back." Judge Green stared at my parents for a long, heavy minute. "Mr. and Mrs. Morgan," she said, her voice like ice, "did you sign and submit this document knowing it was false?" My father opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He looked at Martin, who was staring at the floor. The silence was their confession. "I've heard enough," Judge Green said. She slammed the file shut. "The petition for conservatorship is dismissed with prejudice. I am finding the forfeiture clause valid and enforceable. Carolyn Stephen and Ethan Morgan are hereby stripped of any and all interest in the Henry Morgan Trust. Furthermore, I am referring this matter and the evidence of forgery to the District Attorney's Office for immediate criminal review." The gavel came down. It sounded like a gunshot. "We're done here," the judge said. Pandemonium broke out in the gallery, but I didn't hear it. I felt a rush of blood to my head, a dizzying mix of triumph and nausea. I packed my briefcase with methodical slowness. As I turned to leave, my mother lunged past the bailiff. "Elle," she hissed, her eyes wild, tears streaming down her face. "Elle, wait. We're still your parents. We can fix this. Don't do this to us." I looked at her. I looked at the woman who had smiled while her lawyer called me incompetent. "You did this to yourselves," I said quietly. Ethan was glaring at me, his face red, looking at me like I was the villain who had ruined his life. I walked past him, past my father, who couldn't even meet my eyes, and pushed through the heavy oak doors. I walked out of the courthouse and into the blinding afternoon sun. I was shaking, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I had won. I had destroyed them. And as I stood on the concrete steps taking the first deep breath of my new life, I realized that the hollowness in my chest wasn't from loss. It was from the space where a burden had been lifted. Winning in court didn't feel like the explosion of fireworks I had expected. It felt more like surviving a car crash. You walk away breathing and alive, but you're still standing amidst the wreckage of something that used to be whole. The gavel had come down. The judgment was signed, but the silence that followed was deafening. The consequences for my family were swift and mechanical. The forfeiture clause was not a suggestion. It was a guillotine. The trust funds my parents had been mentally spending for decades were locked away completely out of their reach. Without that infusion of cash, their house of cards collapsed within weeks. I drove past my childhood home a month after the trial and saw the foreclosure sign planted in the front lawn like a tombstone. They had to sell everything to pay the legal fees and the court-ordered sanctions. They moved into a 2-bedroom rental apartment on the south side of town, a place with thin walls and no view, a stark drop from the lakefront pretenses they had clung to for so long. Ethan fared no better. Stripped of his safety net and the promise of a bailout, he was forced to file for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. The entrepreneur persona he had cultivated crumbled. In a small town, news travels faster than light, and the narrative shifted. He wasn't the unlucky businessman anymore. He was the guy who tried to rob his sister and failed. People didn't pity him. They just stopped returning his calls. The district attorney called me in for a meeting regarding the criminal charges. Sitting in that gray office, I felt a strange cocktail of emotions. Given their ages and lack of prior criminal history, the DA told me, "We are declining to pursue custodial sentences. We're pushing for heavy fines, restitution, and probation." I nodded, feeling a knot loosen in my chest. Part of me had wanted them to hurt, to feel the terror they had inflicted on me. But another part of me, the part that remembered Christmas mornings and learning to ride a bike, was relieved. I didn't want to visit my parents in prison. I just wanted them to stop. This felt like justice, real consequences without total destruction. They were free, but they were no longer powerful. The town, however, was harder to navigate. For the first few weeks, I felt the eyes on me in the grocery store. I was the girl who sued her parents. I was the problem. But as the details of the forgery and the sanctions leaked out, small towns have no secrets, the temperature changed. I stopped getting glares and started getting nods. One afternoon, I found a note tucked under my windshield wiper. "Proud of you for standing your ground. Took guts. It wasn't a parade, but it was enough." The American instinct to root for the underdog was slowly overpowering the instinct to protect the status quo. But the nights were the hardest. I would lie awake in my apartment staring at the ceiling, replaying the look on my mother's face when the judge ruled against them. The shock. The betrayal. I heard her voice whispering, "We sacrificed everything for you." The guilt would wash over me thick and suffocating. Had I been too harsh? Should I have just taken the stipend? I started seeing a therapist, a woman recommended by a friend from law school. We spent hours dissecting that word, sacrifice. I realized that my parents only used that word as a currency to buy my compliance. They hadn't sacrificed for me. They had invested in me like a stock, and when I didn't yield the dividends they wanted, they tried to liquidate the asset. Accepting that truth didn't make the grief go away, but it made it bearable. I leaned heavily on Renee and my small circle of friends from the bar association. We became a chosen family, one bound not by blood, but by mutual respect and the radical idea that love shouldn't hurt. With the legal battle over, I finally had access to the trust. The number in the account was staggering. It was enough to buy a mansion, to travel the world, to never work again. But every dollar felt heavy with Hank's memory. I pulled out his binder again, reading his notes about lifting up the ones who get overlooked. I knew I couldn't just hoard this. I didn't want to become them. I spent a week drafting a business plan. I wasn't going to build a tech startup or buy a lake house. I was going to build a ladder. I contacted the community college administration and set up a meeting to establish the Elle Morgan Resilience Fund. It would be a scholarship specifically for students like me, the ones working night shifts, the ones taking 6 years to finish a 4-year degree, the ones the system usually ignored. On the day I went to the bank to finalize the transfer for the foundation, the branch manager ushered me into a private office. He was an older man who had known Hank. "I have something for you," he said, opening a drawer. He pulled out a small, cheap frame. Inside was a photo of me and Hank at my community college graduation. I was wearing my gown looking tired but happy, and Hank was beaming his arm around my shoulder. "He kept this on his desk when he came in to do his banking," the manager said. "He told everyone who would listen that you were the smartest Morgan of the bunch." I held the frame, running my thumb over the glass. My parents had cropped me out of the family photos. They had tried to erase my name from the legal record. But Hank had been here in this bank, making sure the world saw me. He had been planting seeds of my existence even when I felt invisible. "Thank you," I whispered, my voice breaking. I left the bank and walked to my car, clutching the photo. My parents had tried to bury me, but they forgot that I was a seed, and now, thanks to Hank, it was time to grow. A year later, the air in the community college auditorium smelled exactly the way I remembered it: floor wax, nervous sweat, and cheap coffee. But this time, I wasn't sitting in the back row hoping to go unnoticed. I was standing at the podium, looking out at a sea of faces that looked just like mine, used to tired, hungry, and desperate for a break. I smoothed the paper in front of me. "The Elle Morgan Resilience Fund isn't for the students with the perfect grades," I said into the microphone, my voice echoing slightly. "It's for the ones who work the night shift. It's for the ones who take the bus because their car broke down again. It's for the ones who know that showing up is half the battle." 5 students walked up to the stage. There was a young father wearing work boots still dusted with drywall, a single mom who was studying nursing while her kids slept, and 3 others who looked like they hadn't slept in a week. As I handed them the envelopes, each containing enough to cover tuition and rent for a year, I didn't feel the absence of my parents. I felt the overwhelming presence of Hank. He was right there in the handshake of the young man with the drywall dust. He was there in the tearful smile of the nursing student. I realized then that my parents had never understood legacy. They thought legacy was a name on a building or a lake house to brag about. Hank knew legacy was what you leave in the hearts of the people you help. My life outside that auditorium had changed just as drastically. I didn't go back to a big firm. I used the freedom the trust gave me to open a small solo practice in a storefront downtown. The sign on the door read simply, "Elle Morgan, Attorney at Law." My clients weren't corporations hiding assets. They were elderly neighbors trying to protect their homes from predatory developers, and families trying to navigate the messy reality of end-of-life care without tearing each other apart. I offered sliding scale fees and hosted free Know Your Rights workshops in church basements. Every day I was living the American ideal I believed in, using my hard-earned freedom to help others secure theirs. I wasn't doing it alone either. I had met Daniel Reyes 6 months earlier at a community fundraiser. He was a paramedic, a guy who saw the worst of life and still managed to laugh easily. On our 3rd date, I told him the whole ugly story: the ambush, the lawsuit, the forgery. I waited for the usual platitudes, the "but they're still your family" speech. Daniel just took a sip of his beer and nodded. "Sounds like you saved your own life," he said. He never pressured me to reconcile. He never asked me to soften my boundaries for his comfort. It was the first time I understood that love without respect is just control wearing a mask. My boundaries remained absolute. My mother, Carolyn, sent occasional emails. They were masterpieces of public relations filled with vague phrases like, "I'm sorry things got so complicated," and "we miss the way things used to be." There was never an admission of the forgery, Never a true apology for trying to have me declared incompetent. She wanted access, not reconciliation. I replied once a short, polite message. I wish you the best. I need distance to stay healthy. Ethan was less subtle. He sent long, venomous texts accusing me of destroying the family legacy, blaming me for his bankruptcy. I didn't block him immediately. I just let the messages sit there, unread proof that I made the right choice. Choosing myself wasn't cruelty. It was survival. On the anniversary of the court verdict, I drove out to the cemetery alone. The wind was kicking up the leaves around Hank's headstone. I knelt down and placed a copy of the first scholarship brochure on the grass, weighing it down with a small, rough stone I had taken from the steps of the community college. We did good, Grandpa, I said to the cold granite. 5 kids are going to school this year because of you. I told him about the practice, about my condo, a modest place I bought with my own name on the deed, and about the peace I finally felt. I thanked him for believing I was worth protecting, for giving me the tools to fight back when the people who were supposed to love me tried to erase me. For those of you listening to this, you might be thinking that I should have forgiven them. You might think that family comes first no matter what. That's one path. But it wasn't mine. My parents made a choice. They chose to ambush me. They chose to sacrifice my freedom for their financial comfort. They chose to try to legally erase me as a competent adult so they wouldn't have to face their own failures. They bet on my silence. They bet on my fear. But they forgot one thing: I kept the receipts. I kept my name. And I walked out of that courtroom with exactly what they never wanted me to have: my life and the power to decide how I use it. And with Elle Morgan finally reclaiming her narrative, we close the final chapter on a complex tale of familial betrayal and quiet, calculated vengeance. If you were surprised by Elle's secret preparation or the sheer audacity of her parents' plot, let us know in the comments below. We read every single one of your thoughts. If you haven't already, please subscribe for more stories of justice, consequence, and revenge. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Radiance. We'll see you next time.